Tim, the first question I'd like to ask you is, in a world where everybody is talking about the need for change, actually only a few leaders do fundamentally change their situation. What is it that caused you, Tim, to make the changes to what was a regular public radio station in St. Louis?
Rob, what I think we had was kind of an aligning of several things that I think allowed us to pursue the opportunity to double the size of the newsroom. First, it was the environment that we were in St. Louis, where a once great newspaper had fallen onto some real financial challenges because of the changes that had been happening in the world of print, and so they had to take severe staffing cuts and lost a lot of their newsroom. So the opportunity to fill a gap in the market existed because no one else was filling the gap. So that was one. So and the community recognized that, and the community had a hunger for in-depth, smart, contextual-based news that was really not being fulfilled. So you had the market opportunity existed there, and then the other piece was for us was identifying. Well, we want to go from where we were at point one to get to point two, which was to expand our newsroom. And what ways can we do that? So there's one way of incrementally doing it, adding 1 or 2 people a year, but that would have taken us 7 to 10 years to accomplish what we need to accomplish. And in all likelihood, we'd have been too late in the game at that point in time. Somebody else would have stepped up to fill that gap. But because of the fact that the Beacon had existed, the St. Louis Beacon had existed, and this group of people who had taken buyouts for the most part from the Post and had started this online newspaper existed and was getting some audience and getting some recognition, and certainly had some deep connections into the community to raise funds. That was the quickest way to get from point A to point B. In a manner that was consistent with our values, in a manner that would allow us to expand what our digital content was, while also growing the radio and audio content that we knew we needed to do as well. So it gave us the opportunity to fill all of our really ambitions in a manner that was that would get us there as quickly as possible. So as we evaluated all that, it was a matter of saying, okay, if this is the thing to do, then how do we get there?
Right. So you've got the opportunity. The old system is visibly dying, and everybody knows that, and they want a replacement. And you've got an opportunity to go the whole way in one go. So this involves merging 2 cultures. It involves raising money. It involves getting the board, your board on side, and the Beacon people on side. How did you get your ducks in a line?
Well, I think the first thing that we were lucky about was the timing element of it, is the fact that the Beacon had done, as a startup, like any even for-profit startup, they had done a series of funding rounds to fund its initial existence. And so they had done 2 rounds of major funding from philanthropists and foundations, most of them here in St. Louis, and they were really on the edge of having to do a 3rd round if they were going to sustain themselves for the long term. And so as we started the conversation in terms of trying to work together, they were not all that confident that they could go back to many of the same people that they had gone to before and ask for another major gift, without having really evolved their organization or established a true path to a business model that was going to sustain them for the long run. So for the Beacon folks, I think they saw the opportunity to demonstrate to their funders and to the community that by coming together with us, would tell a news story, a bigger story, because of the capacity that we would have by combining our newsrooms together. So from the Beacon standpoint, I think they saw the opening to fulfill what their ambitions had been by starting the Beacon, was to provide public service journalism in a manner that they held when most of them were working for the Post-Dispatch during the great years of newspaper coverage. They could continue that in this new space, working with us and merging into our newsroom. So that was the first step. Another piece that made it, I think, from the Beacon standpoint, easier for them to kind of look at this as something that would be consistent with what they wanted, was the fact that we did not see any requirement to eliminate any staff positions on either side of the organization, because the Beacon, most of the Beacon, 85% of the Beacon staff were in the newsroom, and so there wasn't any need to. We wanted to hire more journalists. We wanted more journalists, so there wasn't going to be any need to eliminate positions there. And so the three folks that worked on the business side could easily be brought into our organization, because we needed to grow in that area as well. So that made it, I think, much easier too to realize and recognize that people weren't going to lose their jobs in the process, through which when most mergers or acquisitions occur, as you well know, usually there's cuts from overlap that occur, and in this case there wasn't. So that made it easier in that standpoint as well. So we had the opportunity that we saw that we wanted to grow, but then we also needed to really work through and build trust among the two newsrooms where the majority of this was going to be happening. And news people, journalists, and primarily are change is hard for all journalists, and for our folks, it was a matter of understanding the skill set that the journalists from the Beacon would bring into our organization. They weren't all that enthusiastic at first, because they really didn't see that these folks could add value to what we were doing. But we did a lot of work on several committees as we were forming this. We broke into several committees to form this and build that trust amongst the newsroom, so that by the time we got to the point of bringing the two organizations together, there was a lot more confidence, and it wasn't entirely there, but a lot more confidence that there would be value to our organization from their perspective by having the Beacon on board. And then it obviously took great leadership from Marty Freivogel, who was the editor and one of the co-founders of the Beacon, who we brought in to lead the newsroom, to really work through how the newsroom would operate in a manner that everyone felt that they were being heard, and that the skill set that everyone brought into the game, I think, benefited the organization. So you had the staff piece to begin with, which was important to get through, because it wasn't going to be successful if the cultures, which there were two very different cultures, if the cultures didn't come together and create a new culture out of that. Then you had the pieces of, and on the governance side with the Beacon, I think answering the business model question was the big concern that they had, and we were able to answer that. And then it took for our governance side, because we're part of the University of Missouri system, was to convince both the leadership on our campus as one of the campuses of the university system here in St. Louis, and they were on board pretty quickly. They saw the benefit. We were able to articulate the benefit there, so they were supportive. It was a little bit more difficult at the system level because they just aren't familiar that much with our operation. They're seeing challenges from a budget standpoint, so there was a lot of risk there that they saw as we looked at the business plan as to how this was going to work. But we also had confidence in telling that story to them, that we had sufficient support locally, at least for a 5-year run, as we were getting major commitments from local philanthropists to support that effort. So it took work along those lines. It ended up adding value to the university system because we were able to bring the University of Missouri Journalism School into play, which is one of the best journalism schools in the world, and in terms of highly respected across the world, they were able to see this. The J School was able to see this as an opportunity as well to explore and experiment and see how new models of journalism could work. So getting that part into the mix, I think, added great value as well from the university standpoint, which actually ended up pushing it over the edge to get this thing done a year ago.
Brilliant. So you have a real ally in the J School here as well. And what I'm hearing is that you also, you were able to convince your local funders to take some of the risk out of the university's budget.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, we worked out a business plan that said we needed to raise $3 million to cover what we saw as an initial gap in funding that over a 5-year period would be reduced down to the point that by year 6 we were self-sustaining without that $3 million funding that we initially went out and raised. But we were able to get one 7-figure gift and several 6-figure gifts and numerous 5-figure gifts to help us achieve that $3 million goal that we're putting into the operation for these first couple of years as we work on building revenue from increased revenue from digital platforms as well as some other models that we're looking at in terms of to grow our revenue.
Tim, I wonder if you passed over quite quickly on the cultural issue, just saying it was a big one and you managed to get through it. But my own experience here is that the make or break is usually in the culture area.
Oh, absolutely. Culture kills strategy every time.
Tell our listeners a bit more about the mechanics and the process of you fixing your cultural risks.
A lot of it, I think, was just really paying very close attention to what was being said, and by giving people a chance to be heard. I'm not a huge meeting person, but I think it was very important as it came together, both before it actually happened and then once it did actually happen, was to be listening and talking and bringing people to the table, asking people how it's going. I probably spent more time just walking around the organization in the newsroom primarily during those first couple of months, just listening and talking and chatting, as did our news leadership. And also make sure that I think people were okay with the idea that we could try something, and if it didn't work, accept that and move on. I think I've always talked about the idea of if you're going to fail fast and fail cheap. And so I think if people know that they have the opportunity to try some things and see if it works, I think they're much more free in terms of, from a culture standpoint, to accept the change is happening. Yeah, but I will tell you though, I think in a lot of ways, while we came together in December of last year, and we've been working pretty well, and a lot of things had been happening in terms of bringing the organization together. We were seeing good audience growth. We were producing good content. It really wasn't until a couple of things happened this summer that helped, I think, really trigger, I think, what has now become truly one newsroom. And the first was that we had planned in our budget planning with the merger that we would be adding new staff from the outside. So it wasn't just our people coming together with the people from the Beacon into one, but we had budgeted to hire 5 new positions as part of our growth plan. And I think that's done a lot for us as well, because we brought new people from the outside who were very, very enthusiastic about coming here because they saw what was happening, they saw the energy, they saw the interest in the community, they saw a new model being created. And so getting these folks from the outside to come in that didn't have any cultural history or institutional history with either of the organizations has been really, I think, something that's been very energizing for everybody in the organization, both in the newsroom and out of the newsroom. So I think that piece happened, and we really started bringing folks on board in June for that. So it was a course of about 6 weeks. The last person as part of the group that was hired the Monday after Michael Brown's shooting. But it really was what's happened in Ferguson that has really totally unified the newsroom because of just the push that has occurred from that, the fact that we basically had to turn into a 24/7 newsroom, and people were being asked to push themselves in ways that they had never been pushed before across every level of the newsroom. People were asked to cover a story that may end up being the biggest story of their life. Margie Freivogel, who worked for 35 years for the Post-Dispatch here in St. Louis, and basically said, she's been doing this for 40 years, but she said this was the biggest story I've ever covered. And our young people who've been doing, just out of J school for a couple of years have recognized that this may be the biggest story they ever covered. And I think those that kind of energy forced us and drove us to try new things, to push ourselves, I think, to the level that the audience discovered us. They found us both locally. They recognized this resource that they may have not recognized before, both on radio as well as online, through the content that we were producing on the site. And I think that was very gratifying and fulfilling for the staff to recognize that their work was being seen and heard by a whole lot more people than had been seeing and hearing what we were doing before. It was important, and vital public service that they were providing.
Tim, this brings me to the point of it all, really. So you've got your stakeholders on side, you've got your staff on side. What about the audience? What about the listener? Tell me about how that's been going.
Yeah, I think one of the real challenges that I think public radio has overall is that we have been primarily driven audience-wise by when there's major national and international news events, we see the audience increase, and mostly that's been because most of the time our local content has been less than interesting, and there hasn't been enough local content to bring all that much value to the audience. And that's not universal across the board. There's some organizations that are doing some just incredible work, but for the most part, I think that's the case. And so I think what happened with this event particularly, and it happened with on the air because our reporters were filing so much with NPR and with other national news organizations. They were being heard both by our local audience but by a national audience on their work. So I think that triggered, I think, the value that our local audience said that, well, if these folks are filing on NPR consistently, there must be a pretty good value with what these folks are doing on a local basis. But I think the real sign of this came from what we saw on the digital side, where our audience increased 5 or 6 times more than what we've been seeing in terms of traffic to our website and page views. That the results of that was the fact that our intent with doing this merger was to not only build a platform to do more and better radio, but to build a platform so that our digital journalism, text-based photos that people could read on their desktop or on their phone or their iPad would increase the value of our service. And that was I think the thing that truly happened with this was that and a lot of it was because we really set about, I think, and the person who led our social media strategy did a brilliant job in reaching out to people and growing the trust that people who may not have known our service before discovered it. And a lot of that was done through our social media channels as well.
Right. So maybe one other side of this is you and I have talked in the past about a change in how you raise money from your listeners. I listen to Vermont Public Radio, and a very traditional, Tim. It's it seems like every other week there's a pledge drive, I know that's not true, but that's what it feels like.
Mm-hmm.
And I believe that you're doing something a little different from that. I mean, you're still doing pledge drives. I wonder if you could talk about subscriptions.
Yeah, well, I think the sustainer model is happening in a lot of places, but we're trying to move as much of that as quickly as possible. So, I mean, right now we have close to 40% of our 21,000 members that are on the sustaining membership of which is kind of a subscription model in a way. Most of those folks are paying monthly installments at $5 or $10 or $20 or $30 or $40 or $50 a month. On a monthly basis, and I think that begins to build a model of consistency that people are comfortable with what they're doing. One of the things that we found in the sustainer model, and that's where it's so important to get out in front of this early before other nonprofits sign up, is that people who are, what we found in some research is that people who are choosing to give in that way as monthly donors are giving to fewer organizations than what they had before, because they just see from a monthly budget planning standpoint there are only so many organizations that they'll support, and so the folks who are doing that are giving to less organizations. So it's important to get there in front of them first and be one of the get your stake in the ground. And so we're working very hard on that. So it's a combination. I mean, there's several combinations in terms of the revenue standpoint. The sustainer piece on the annual giving side is huge. I think building the trust of the philanthropic community, which again has recognized in major ways the work that we've been doing over the last several months, pre and post Ferguson, I think is important. I mean, it's not, we don't want our major gift philanthropy to be the dominant place for our revenue, because then you're dependent on a few people or a few organizations to fund your organization, and that can bring incredible risk to it.
Yes.
And then the other piece is because on the advertising and marketing corporate side of things, so much money is moving to the digital platforms, is the intent of growing our digital platforms will pay off, because we'll be going to where that money is flowing to, and we'll be working very hard towards growing our revenue through those platforms. So I mean, it's all of those things. Plus, we're looking at as a lot of news organizations are now, is an event strategy built around our journalism and engaging with the community through events in ways that we've never done before as well.
I mean, the Guardian in London is building an enormous commons. Tim, have you seen that?
I've heard about it. I don't think I've actually seen any drawings or pictures of it.
And they're starting to ask people if they'd like to become members.
Mm-hmm.
So, Tim, I wonder if you could conclude here by talking about the commons, and also with your relationship with the Nine Network next
year. Sure. I mean, the commons is somewhat symbolic. It is symbolic, really, in terms of what we envision as the relationship with the public television station here in St. Louis, the Nine Network of Public Media, in the fact that the commons was a parking lot and there were walls dividing our two organizations and our two buildings, and so the walls came down, the parking lot went away, and we created this public space to invite the public in. Very much associated with the idea that our two organizations are connected in public service, in the public service mission, and so I think the symbolism of that is critical. But then the actual execution of what we do in this space will be just as important. Now it's just been open for a couple of weeks, but we really do envision it as a place to engage people around arts and culture, to look at opportunities that we can bring people together to have conversations. We'll be doing that next week with a joint event around the StoryCorps project, where people share their oral histories, and they've actually created some incredible animation video around those stories that we'll be using in the projection screens, as well as having a conversation with people in the space around that. And so, I mean, I think it's really that and in my mind, those types of things, having a place that you can put a face, particularly for an entity that's primarily an audio entity, that you don't have that visual sensibility or that feel or touch by having a place that you can bring people together to interact face to face, I think builds that reputation and builds the trust beyond even what they get through the content that they may see or hear with what we do.
Yeah, it's just incredible. Tim, one last thing, if you could forecast a little bit into the future, and maybe start with St. Louis and then talk about your hopes and dreams for the rest of the system.
Yeah, I mean, I think in our case, we have chosen to start with content first and the technology and tools second. And I think I think there's going to be a real need to have some of the people that can write, the coders and developers, to help us build more tools and products, so to speak, in a digital platform to better serve our audience down the road. So that's a place I think visual elements for us is going to be growing to be more important as audiences continue to move more towards digital platforms. Yeah. So photography and video and creative uses of that maintain our values and tell stories in the way that we hope to tell will be I think something that we'll be looking at significantly more in the future. And I think the other piece of it is diversity of building the talent base within our organization that represents the diverse parts of our community, both racially and gender and ethnicity, so that our newsroom reflects the community and has the background and experiences that can help tell stories about all sectors of the community, and in a way that we've been kind of challenged in the past, and that's going to be one of those things that is just an ongoing something you really have to work at to be able to do that.
Yeah, you have to make it deliberate. It just seems to be...
Yeah, it just doesn't happen.
No,
Absolutely.
It doesn't happen. It doesn't happen.
So, as far as the system goes, I think we're at an interesting point. I mean, I think there are major markets that still have the competition for audiences, particularly on digital platforms, is much different than what it is here in St. Louis. I mean, we saw the gap here to not only provide strong audio for our radio listeners or people who may listen through a stream and whatnot, but we saw a huge gap to deliver digital content, text-based digital content on our website and through phones. In a lot of major cities, in New York or Chicago or in LA, where there's a lot of good journalism going on from what is traditional for-profit media, I think their competitiveness is something that their decisions from a strategy standpoint may be different from middle-sized markets like ours, where the newspaper, which was the primary place for people to convene and really that point of news content that people would go to first, where in a lot of middle markets, those newspapers are truly failing and leaving this gap. I think it's different for major markets that may have a different competitive environment. It's certainly different from NPR, and I think that's one of the places that NPR maybe is very challenged, because there are, on a text-based standpoint, and they're making some changes on their digital side from text-based news, they're focused, I think, very much on how they can adapt to delivering audio through digital platforms and what that means to stations, because obviously, every listener that goes to listen to audio on a digital platform can listen. They aren't bound by the geographic monopoly that we have with broadcast signals. Every time somebody does that at a local level, there's a chance that they may not be listening to that local station. But still, in NPR's world, local stations are providing the majority of revenue. So there's this whole push and pull going on in terms of a strategy to reach audiences on digital platforms, but also recognize what the business model is going to change to in the future.
Yes.
So there's a lot of challenges, but I think we're lucky enough to be in a position that I think having a clear strategic vision of what we want to accomplish, because we can do both, meet both ends of the spectrum in terms of filling the gap that exists in local news, is pretty exciting from our standpoint.
So in conclusion, Chairman, it seems in middle markets, almost everywhere, there is the equivalency of the Post-Dispatch disappearing, which seems to offer the middle market stations a bit of a leg up, doesn't it?
It does, but I think the big challenge there is the revenue piece. We have been very lucky to be in a place where where there are incredibly generous people who care about public service journalism, and in a lot of ways we're very lucky that the Beacon set itself out there 6 years ago to establish itself in that manner and build those relationships that we were able to bring in and grow even further. So I think it has to start in some ways through that seed money so that organizations can grow beyond the 1 or 2 additional staff people a year, which is a challenge. And I think that's the biggest challenge that a St. Louis or a Pittsburgh will face in these kind of middle-sized markets is being able to grow fast enough to fill the gap in the market that exists, because if you don't, somebody else will find a way to fill that gap.
Tim?
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Rob. This is fantastic. Love it.